Can you introduce yourself for us?
Sure. My name is Christy Beeling. I have 6 years teaching experience, 1 year in a public school in Minnesota, 3 years in a private school in Saipan, and 2 years experience teaching at a private school in Hawaii.
Perfect. And what experience do you have working with underprivileged students?
Sure. So my first year working in the public schools in Minnesota, I had a class of 30, and I would say at least half I know received help with lunches, and so that shows that they were below a certain income level. I also worked in that year with many English language learners. Most of them spoke Spanish as their native language, and I also had quite a few students, 4 or 5 students in that class who were on IEP and needed special services throughout the school day. In Hawaii and Saipan, because I've worked more in private schools, I haven't seen as many students that were maybe below poverty line, although in each class I would say there were a few students that met that criteria. But I've worked with, each of those classes were filled with at least a handful of kids that were not white, that were either of Asian heritage or Mexican heritage, and probably a few others as well.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dana Kern, and I'm a student here at Aspen University. There are definite biases in the labor market as far as educational attainment and income levels, gender. We still see that males are making more money than females for the same job done. We do see more money being made with the higher degrees, so certainly education can impact how much money someone eventually makes. However, education hasn't been able to solve the inequality that we see in our country. Education certainly has made a difference, especially for those with less income, those who are poor. More education will put them into better jobs, better paying jobs, and overall will help the economy. But there's a huge gap in income that education just hasn't been able to solve, and that comes from family conditions. Those with more money have more resources, I believe. Those with more money are able to provide their kids more tutoring, more services, more resources, more opportunities as they go through their schooling and eventually end up in the job market. I don't know that education will ever be able to solve the inequality, the overall inequality we see in our country. It hasn't been successful thus far, and I think there's just too many factors involved as far as the inequalities that people experience in their environment as they go through school. Can you discuss the relationship between family income and a student's cultural background and educational achievement?
Sure. Now, one of the relationships that sticks out to me the most in terms of students who come from a non-traditional, especially white family in America, going into the educational system in America, is just the difficulties that you see with kids connecting with the curriculum, especially that's in public schools, that's mandatory to use. The 4th grade that I taught in Minnesota, again, a lot of students that were of Mexican heritage, and a lot of the books that we would read were with white characters, or would focus a lot on the American history. Of course, you do get in Native American history, but especially kids that spoke Spanish as a first language, there's just such a divide between the language and the cultural background they were coming from and the literature that we needed to read in class. And so that was definitely a learning curve, teaching and trying to bridge those gaps when there weren't a lot of resources given to me, especially my first year of teaching. Let's see, then the more recently working in private schools, I've really enjoyed that I haven't had to use a certain curriculum, because I could use the curriculum more geared towards my population of students, and mix and match and try to make it meet their needs. But you also just see, another big thing was families from different cultural backgrounds say from my own growing up in a small town in Minnesota, just navigating the school system can be really difficult for families that didn't grow up in our school system in America. Actually, for instance, the past couple of years at a small school that I'm at in Hawaii, I've noticed that my students whose parents don't come from America, they have a lot harder time with the science fair because the science fair is very American. And almost everyone who grows up in an American school did the science fair every year growing up, or at least had the opportunity to try it out. Whereas, for instance, a girl in my class last year, her mom was from Europe. And her mom came to me and just said, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do at the science fair. Whereas most of the other moms and dads were really familiar because they did it growing up. So you definitely see like schools, the school system can be really hard to navigate for families that didn't grow up in an American school system.
So what biases do you see in education that affect educational attainment and ultimately the job market?
Sure, so you see a lot of biases in education that I think go on to affect the job market. Definitely families' income level, and specifically if they are below the poverty line. I think there's a big bias to those kids moving on and going to college and getting high paying jobs. Definitely white privilege, I think you see in all the school systems that I've been in, although obviously you work with great, amazing educators that work against those. Gender, women still are not paid the same, so there's clearly a bias there. I think definitely too in terms of women taking time off to have babies, that affects things, and there's a bias with women who are of childbearing age later on, so you still see that as they go through the education system. But another main bias that I see is with students with disabilities or special needs. As they get older, maybe they've been given or they've worked with educators who help meet those needs and assist them in those areas, and going on into the job market, I don't feel it's as readily accessible or available to those students who have a wide variety of special needs.
Family income and cultural background definitely affect someone's ultimate income level, and that has to do with opportunities that are available. It is shown that different races make different amounts of money for the same job done. In particular, African American people are making less than Caucasian people in the United States for the same job they do. Family backgrounds and income levels are affecting ultimate income levels, and I think it again boils down to the opportunities that are available to these families of different income levels, different cultural backgrounds, the resources that are available for these youth. I think that youth who are determined can potentially work really hard and get to the same level as someone who is of a different cultural background or different family background, but the numbers speak louder than that, and ultimately there's going to be inequality built into our labor market. It's very sad. Education should be able to solve these issues, but unfortunately education doesn't solve these issues, because in schools the same two students could go through the same schooling, end up in the same job, and be paid different amounts because of family background, educational background, the resources they've had growing up. It really is a sad state. I believe that education is the best means to create a stable and equitable society. I believe that there needs to be a lot of work done, though, before we can get to this point. I don't know that education will ultimately be successful. However, educators need to be sure not only to provide the same education to youth, but also to provide resources to those youth who don't have resources outside of school. I think part of the reason that some students are more successful than others with the same education has to do with the connections they have outside of school and the resources they're given as youth. And as educators, we need to provide our students with the additional resources if they're not getting them outside of school. And ultimately, I think that's the best chance of creating a stable and equitable society for our youth. I think our society is up for the task of creating that stable and equitable society for all youth. I think that many educators out there want that for their youth. They want their students to be successful and they want to be a part of it. Sometimes they're in schooling systems where not everyone feels that way or works that hard, which is unfortunate. But I think that if enough educators start fighting for their youth, start providing those resources needed, and really start standing up to make that difference, I believe that there's potential, and I do think that we are up for the task as educators. There is the issue of equality of educational opportunity. We see that schools in poor neighborhoods have less resources and their students don't do as well. And we need to do better as a society. We need to do better at providing equal opportunity for students. If students are forced to go to the school that is in their poor district and has less funding, we are not going to see as much success as students in wealthier neighborhoods who go to schools with more money and more resources and more ability to create more opportunity. So as communities, we need to really even out our schools and provide more equal opportunity for our youth if we want to see future success. The inequalities that exist between schools and school districts that create inequalities in the labor market eventually for our youth, I think primarily have to do with, again, funding and resources. Different neighborhoods have different fundings, different resources. I know that when I lived in California, we had property taxes and the lottery that went towards our schools, and we had much better schools. Now that I live here in Hawaii, the public schools get very little funding here. They're overcrowded, underfunded, and the kids here don't get the same opportunities. It really is quite sad. And the charter schools that do have more funding and more opportunity have long wait lists to get in. They do a lottery and it's almost impossible to get in. So I think that it ultimately comes down to money and what kind of money and resources are we putting into our schools in order to create these equal educational opportunities for our youth. I haven't seen the money that's needed here in Hawaii, and that is why my kids are not in public school here, which I find sad because I grew up in California and went through great public school systems and feel like I got an outstanding education. And unfortunately, the public schools here in Hawaii are not able to provide my kids with that same opportunity. There are overcrowded classrooms, and I think this is probably all over the United States, but overcrowded classrooms, underfunding, just not enough money and resources to provide opportunities for our youth. And that's what needs to change in order to provide equal educational opportunity and ultimately start to make that difference in the labor market down the road. Another factor that I believe is contributing to the inequality of educational opportunity is our quality of teachers, and it is really hard to get teachers in these underfunded, poor schools that really need good teachers in there to help these youth and give them opportunities. Yet they are not paid well, and they have some very difficult working environments, and I think these schools really have a hard time getting quality teachers in there, and having quality teachers in there would give their youth more opportunity, more educational opportunity, and ultimately a better chance of getting a little closer to equality in the labor market. So recruiting teachers, better pay, better working conditions are all things that we can do in education in order to help provide more equality in education. Discuss the pros and cons of full inclusion. What measures should be taken by schools to ensure that this endeavor is successful?
Sure, so there's a lot of pros and some cons to full inclusion in classrooms. The biggest pro that I see is that students with receiving special education services have, every single one that I've ever met, has many talents and many gifts, many strengths and things that they're good at. And so putting those kids in a classroom with other students who don't have special needs, simply put, people get to be around that person and they get to glean and learn from whatever the strengths of that student with special needs are. So the biggest strength is simply being around someone that has a unique strength that is likely different, than the general population in that classroom. Another strength is maybe that the student with special needs has a weakness, and the students in that classroom get to learn, how can we help? Say the little boy's name is Johnny, who has difficulty focusing on a task, and he blurts out, or maybe even gets angry at certain times. Well, if we put Johnny in the general education classroom, the kids around him are going to learn, hey, how can I help Johnny? Maybe there's a little game I can play with him that kind of calms us down before we go into the classroom. And students in the general education population are going to learn to, this goes on to another strength of full inclusion, is they're going to learn to develop empathy. One of the strongest indicators of success in life, right, is how you interact with other people and how you show empathy. So we're teaching the skills, probably the most valuable skill in life. How do we empathize with other people? How do we enjoy them and love them, no matter how they might be different from us? So that's definitely, I think, the biggest strengths that I see in full inclusion classrooms. The con can be that maybe there's a student that really needs a lot of attention and can be very distracting. And maybe at times it does distract the other students and take away from their learning, on a certain activity or task or during a test. So of course then the struggle is, how do we teach educators how to balance that and make those times less distracting for everyone. Another con that I could see happening in circumstances is maybe a student is in the general education setting and they become discouraged because maybe they're not able to complete the same math as their peers. And so if they have the type of personality that really compares themselves to others, maybe they would start to feel really discouraged and maybe not try as hard, or maybe just get real sad because they can't do what their peers happen to be doing. So I'd say those are two of the cons that I see in a full inclusion classroom.
Thank you. I appreciate your help today.